Sorry. All right. Okay, so we have some time. Andrew, you had like 4 minutes. You good? All right. I was just about to signal, and you were like wrapping up. I'm like, okay. So we have some questions from the floor, and I have some kind of setup questions for folks as well. Lead with something that's actually for all of you, and it's how does your work help us investigate, sensitize individuals to understand and potentially stop state discretionary uses of power? I mean, a large part of the difficulty we're talking about is that there are people who are empowered, allowed, set forth among the population, and they can do largely what they wish within very broad scopes. And so part of the issue is how do we check this discretionary element? And what I heard from the presentations, I think are actually quite different responses to that. So if you could speak to that issue of trying to check discretionary power, and we can go in the order or whatever.
Oh, yeah, great. So I think part of my work has tried to understand the role of Black citizens to shift institutional structures, right? So specifically, the focus has been about the NAACP working in the first quarter of the 20th century. And is it possible, could the NAACP be an organization that at some level could fight back against extreme violence? And for me, one of the things that's really interesting when you focus on that civil rights struggle is the NAACP did not have in their mind that like this is the institution that we should like push on. It wasn't this belief in courts from the outset, but they really believed that individuals mobilizing on the ground could then shift institutional structures. They first very just quickly focused on Congress, the presidency, and then they moved really kind of the energy to focus on courts. And so for me, in terms of this question about is it possible to resist these structures, I think it is. I think the experience of the NAACP in the first quarter of the 20th century, despite how bad things are right now, the teens and the 20s were markedly more difficult experience for Black folk in this country than right now. And the NAACP still organized, and they were able to shift the judiciary in a direction, it did not fully, right? But they were actually able to win some inroads in the Supreme Court and also in federal courts in this earlier period. So for me, I think that's instructive in terms of how we form and how we mobilize right now. I think it needs to be on the ground, and I also think it needs to be connected to institutional structures.
Let me just say that in my study of the police, I have been astounded at the degree of discretion, and essentially the standard deviation on every variable is astounding. And when you think about, like, we've analyzed the likelihood that you'll get a ticket depending on the ID number of the officer who pulls you over if you're speeding. And it ranges from 0 to 100. And we've analyzed the likelihood that you'll get searched, and it ranges, depending on the officer, for the same type of traffic stop, it ranges from 0 to about 60% likelihood of search for speeding, where the average is 3. Now, if these people were school teachers, the principal would do something about that. But they're not school teachers. They're not other kinds of civil servants. They're not welfare officers. They're police officers. They're accustomed to having astounding amounts of discretion and very little oversight. So when they use that, to the extent that they have unbounded discretion, all kinds of considerations, as the Supreme Court might say, judicially acceptable and extrajudicial types of considerations come into play, and it's astounding what happens. But I want to suggest that it's not only what you might think of as implicit psychological bias. There's a lot of institutional structures involved in this. For example, we have 18,000 police departments in our country. That's more than we have school districts. We have so many school districts that you don't even have to think that individual school teachers might have implicit bias. It's enough just to recognize that there's rich and poor school districts that each sit on their own financial bottom based on property taxes. That's just enough right there to create all the discrimination or disparities that you might want. And that's not subject to a national movement to try to change that. Similarly with police departments, there's 18,000 of them. Each one is autonomous. They're very resistant to calls for national standards. That's socialism, okay? So the American way is local control, and I think that we have not sufficiently realized the price of federalism and the price of local control in our communities as it relates to racial disparities and other forms of disparities. So it's not just psychological bias, it's institutional structures.
I'm Jeremy. So yeah, I think police discretion is like my number one, many pet peeves. And I think my work has been about pointing out that police officers are not there to enforce unjust laws that can be struck down. Police officers make law every single day when they exercise that discretion, when they decide who to stop, who's suspicious, who's not, who you're going to give a warning to, who you're going to punish, how you're going to punish them, what you're going to charge them with, right? And so to me, that is the central reason that Dr. King and others talk about policing as the front line of every effort to achieve equality or justice or liberation in this country, because they have so much power. Like one encounter with a police officer can literally change the entire course of your life, and a lot of that has to do with the discretion they're able to exercise. My mission has also been to show that they exercise that discretion to police our bodies in public spaces and in private spaces in ways that are deeply racially gendered, that their job is as much about maintaining racial relations of power or class-based relations of power as gendered relations of power. From the beginning of police forces, their job has been to police prostitution. So they used to call it a common night walker law. Now they call it loitering for purposes of prostitution. But either way, it's about policing the presence of women's bodies in public spaces. And in the time that Megan was talking about around the Reconstruction, vagrancy and prostitution laws were a #1 way that black women's bodies were taken and put right back in the homes that they had just ostensibly been liberated from through convict leasing. And that also, that police have always been about policing literally the lines of the gender binary. So we talk now about, bathroom laws, and our police officers can be able to arrest people for using the wrong bathroom. They've been doing that all along. But some of the first laws, again, that police were charged with enforcing were cross-dressing laws. And I've heard from trans women that, those laws are struck down and now they just arrest us for loitering for the purposes of prostitution or disorderly conduct. So in other words, the police are going to continue to use their discretion in order to police the racialized lines of gender, race, class, and ability, and morality and sexuality. That's what they're about. So we need to take, and also, that's again in the context of responses to violence, right? So domestic violence used to not be against the law, right? Rape of a black woman used to not be a crime. Now, the police just arrest Marissa Alexander when she defends herself from domestic violence. Now, the police just arrest the survivor of sexual violence for, defending herself or filing a report and then withdrawing it because she doesn't want to deal with the police, and they call her, they prosecute her for filing a false report. So now, we just make those things law in a different way. And so, to me, the solution is to take police discretion out of the equation, which under the system that we have means taking the police out of the equation altogether as much as possible, and finding alternate ways of actually producing safety for all of us, including and especially black women, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming people, because that will produce safety for all of us.
Something that's kind of like underlying the conversation, but isn't necessarily explicit. I'd like to highlight for a second. So as we talk about kind of like the police action in the United States, and as it targets African Americans, like we'll talk about democracy, we'll talk about accountability, we'll talk about bias, we'll talk about threat. All of you in different ways have talked about power, but we don't actually openly have conversations about power enough. So it's kind of like, how are you conceiving power? And in a sense, it's manifested by not only the police, some would argue that maybe the police violence is actually a manifestation of weakness, not power. If they had other forms or other manners of, there's an old debate and discussion in political science literature about power and influence, which is kind of like old now because people don't talk about it. The first face of power is kind of what we're talking about, it's like people engaging in violence against a particular population. If you actually have other faces of power, other manifestations of power, you don't have to engage in this base level form of activity because you have other ways of influencing them. So in a sense, we're talking about the first face of power, the most coercive, the most forceful, and this suggests that there's not persuasive power, there are not other manifestations of it, but we rarely make that kind of discussion explicit. So you all have kind of engaged with power in a sense in your work, but how explicit do you kind of make that particular consideration? How important is it to kind of better contextualize or sensitize individuals to that? Or is this completely irrelevant? It's not about power, it's about something else.
I could start us by saying that, there's a lot of people that are either, in my research, they're either blissfully unaware of what's going on, or they're quite content with the behavior of the police. I think that when you think about the differences in how the police approach members of different demographic groups, middle-class white voters quite enjoyed their interactions with the police. And they may, not all of them, because nobody likes to get a ticket, but there's bad news and there's really bad news. Furthermore, the degree of social control, I don't think the police are making that up without any support from much of the community, and certainly elected officials support policies that they consider to be, quote unquote, tough on crime, tough on criminals. So I don't think these things are made up by the police without support from large segments of the community. And the best thing that you could say about that support is that those people are unaware of what's going on. And the worst thing is that they support it. And I think there's some parts of both of those. So bringing attention to this, I think, is really important, and creating some kind of empathy. Understand, you can't have empathy if you don't have understanding. And the biggest thing that we have in our country right now, I think, well, not just right now, but we've had it for a long time, is an empathy gap, a racial empathy gap. People are not even aware, and if they are aware, if they're made aware, they can't get their head around what it's like to be a trans woman interacting with a police officer late at night. Because for someone that looks like me, you can't even imagine a police officer would be disrespectful to you. I've never experienced it. So there's an understanding gap, and there's an empathy gap, and there's a political gap.
Oh, that's such a good question. In part because I think these questions about power and racial power are so important to discussions around criminal justice and also in political science. I don't have the perfect answer to this. I've been trying to think through this for a while. For me, in terms of how am I conceptualizing power, one of the things that is clear, at least in terms of my research around the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, that the state is envisioning power around control of black bodies, whether that's through laws that are being passed and or for law enforcement officers and through police or through mob violence. One of the things I've tried to resist in my research is to refer to mob violence and lynchings as extra-legal violence. I don't really think it's extra-legal. I think that there's ways in which the state sanctioned these different forms of violence. So the Supreme Court case that sits at the center of my book is a case called Moore v. Dempsey, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1923. It's centered on basically how 12 African-American men in Phillips County, Arkansas were being railroaded to death. They received the electric chair, but their jury trial was, for each of the men, was between 5 minutes and 17 minutes each, and they were tried in a courtroom that was dominated by a mob, right? So, and the mob threatened the jury that if the jury did not convict the men, that the mob would then go after the jury, right? So they were like, all right, cool, we're gonna, right? But I say that to say that I think that like that's also a form of power. I think mobs work as in a type of power, especially in this period over Black lives. I think lynchings also did that. It wasn't even, I think, and this is something that scholars in various disciplines have been very good at describing, the kind of the racial terror of this period, right now that we're in, the racial terror of the earlier period. It wasn't just in the killing of, let's say, Rekia Boyd, wasn't just in the killing of Mike Brown, wasn't just in the lynching of specific people, but it was also in the terror that brought to the larger community, right, of Black people, and the power through the killings that the state felt that they controlled over African Americans. And I still think that today, the policing and the criminal justice system is used in a way to try to contain and control Black movement and Black freedom. So,
yeah, I mean, the reason that you articulate is the reason my work, people often ask me, like, why is your work only focused on police? Frank just said, do you work on corrections officers? And it's, no, I've been obsessed with police for 20 years because they are the front lines of the state. They are the face of power of the state. But also in the criminal legal system and criminalization, that there's no greater power the state can exercise over you than to put you in a cage and torture you and kill you. And I'm sad that we didn't get time to talk about, Frank's research on the death penalty because, again, that's the kind of exercise of state power that starts with an encounter with a police officer and some decisions the police officer makes in terms that then get picked up and pushed through the system. So I think it is no accident that the Black Lives Matter movement is focused on police and state violence because it is the front line of state power. And what Dr. King's Other America speech sort of reminds us to attend to is the economic conditions, structurally created economic conditions that literally funnel us into the path of the police and put us literally with no other choice but to come into the direction of the police. So whether it's housing, homelessness, education, unemployment, economic abandonment of communities, there comes a point where the only government entity you are going to come into contact with is the police, and they are not there to help you. And so I think that for me is why focusing on that location of power and how that discretion is exercised, that tremendous power of discretion is exercised, and on the larger kind of crisis of mass criminalization, not just mass incarceration, but mass criminalization that's taking place in every institution of our society is where we need to focus in order to realize the dream.
Some questions from some students. This, I think, also is directed towards many of you. Do skin differences matter, light skin, dark skin, and class for what it is you're talking about?
oh, me?
Everybody.
Oh. No. Okay, cool. Again, in my period, it does not matter, right? I mean, there is clearly, I think one of the best examples that I like to use, there's clearly a history of passing for some African Americans, but I'm still dealing very much in the aftermath of slavery and thinking about the one-drop rule. One of my favorite examples is around Walter White, like not the Breaking Bad Walter White, right? Like the NAACP Walter White. I had a picture in my slides, which we didn't get to. Walter White is a very light-skinned African American, light skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. He was Black though, right? And he realized that very quickly when there was a race massacre in Atlanta. He was assistant secretary, second in charge in the NAACP, right behind James Weldon Johnson. And he used his ability to pass as a white man, and he conducted dangerous lynching investigations all across the South. And so he would use his ability, he would go, let's say, to Phillips County, Arkansas. He would just not roll up, but on a train, obviously. And then he would talk to people, and they'd be like, you know what, let me tell you what went down. He went and talked to the mayor at the time of Elaine, Arkansas, where this race massacre of over 300 African Americans occurred, and they were like, yep, this is what happened. He would leave, and then he would write all about it and create national attention. This is a very long way of saying that, at least in the period in which I'm focusing on, because there was such kind of very strong distinctions between white and Black that there really wasn't.
And I'll say, I mean, obviously it does matter, right? Like my experience and my mother's experience of policing are very different. I am a survivor of police violence. I have been targeted for it. It was more about poverty and class and youth at that point than it was about skin color, I think. I mean, it's hard to know how the officer read me at the time, but it definitely matters. And at the same time, I think poverty and class are important as well, right? And I think that where it also matters is in terms of, at least in the case of Claudette Colvin versus Rosa Parks, also in terms of who people rally around, right? That people rally around, Sandra Bland's story deserves all the national attention it got and 18 million times more. And Sandra Bland was a member of a black sorority, a college graduate, and came from a middle-class family. And there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of women who experience what she experienced. 5 black women died in jail the same month Sandra Bland did. And hundreds and thousands of darker-skinned women than me who have experienced police sexual violence, whose stories will never get told, who will never get to write a book about it, who will never get to speak out about it or sue the police for it, right? So I feel like both of those things matter very much, both in terms of whose stories we know, who gets to even fight for justice, and whose stories we rally around and how our movements are focused. So I urge us all to acknowledge that in our own relationships of privilege and power in those situations, and how they play out in our strategies.
Just very quickly, I would just add that as a data guy, if I can measure it, I can find an effect for it. And I don't have data on skin tone, but we know, for example, for some states, how old is your car? And if you drive an older car, there's an additional punishment from the police, okay? In terms of punishment, I mean in terms of increased likelihood of adverse outcome. So when we look at race, we find an impact. When we add gender to race, we find an additional impact of those intersectional categories. When we add class to that, we find an additional impact of that. Out-of-state plate, additional impact for that. We don't have data on skin color, skin tone. I've seen research on the death penalty that shows that skin tone matters for the likelihood that the jury would sentence you to death. So if we can measure it, we can find an effect. Every one of these identities affects how strangers interact with you, especially in the context of low information police encounters.
Okay, so we have one more, and so as not to have us all leave in a lurch or a state of some sort, I wish to try to focus it in a particular direction, which is, okay, so many aspects of the things you talk about have a kind of compilation and an analytic component to it, and then an action component to it. So I'm seeing Frank's data, I'm just like, okay, so what's that lawsuit that's happening in North Carolina? Okay, but we also have identified some limitations that we're having with regards to the information that we've compiled, the analyses we've been able to run, and the actions that we can take. And so what's your kind of agenda going forward, or things that you'd put forth out to the audience about, okay, this is what we need to compile, this is what we need to understand, and this is what we need to do?
So I have some ideas. I think the charge and responsibility that I am taking on and urging all of you to take on as well is, for a long time I was about documenting the problem, and I'm still about documenting the problem, right? I'm about making stories that are invisible visible, highlighting how what we know happens in certain contexts also happens in contexts where the police are supposed to be helping, and so what are we doing, and are we really pursuing safety for all members of our communities, and are we doing that effectively? And I kind of always thought, okay, so my job is to point out the harm and to do harm reduction by suing and trying to get policies passed, et cetera, and I still do that. But the other people should come up with the alternative vision of safety and the way that we're going to actually keep each other safe. And I would support that, and I'll get behind that, and please hurry up and do that, because it's hard to keep pushing off the state in this way. But I'm increasingly thinking this is all our charge. It's all of our charge to make sure that there are no more Shelley Hilliards. I mean, that doesn't ever happen to anyone ever again. It's our charge to make sure that there are no more Marissa Alexanders. It's our charge to make sure there are no more Aura Rain Rossers. And it's our charge to find ways for all the women and queer and trans people in our communities who can't call the police or don't call the police for safety because, one, they don't answer, and two, when they do, they're as likely to arrest us or beat us or kill us. So let's just not. But then now we're living with unspeakable violence in our lives and our communities, right? So for me, the action is actually to make the police irrelevant and to actually build safety for everyone in our communities. That, to me, is the charge, which doesn't sound as fun or exciting as filing a lawsuit or passing a law or getting a policy or even impeaching someone, right? But that's actually what is going to keep Black women, queer and trans folks, people safe, and that is actually also what's going to help us address the other economic conditions that we're talking about, because then it's also about taking mutual responsibility for each other having housing, for each other having meaningful employment and, exploration of our human potential, and also taking responsibility for all of us having access to health care, and so on. So I think it's that approach of really building in our communities a responsibility for each other and each other's safety and well-being that is the real work that is going to help us to build a whole other America that has never existed, but does in our dreams and can exist in reality.
So I read history in part so I don't go crazy, because I think that, and I say this genuinely, that our paths can light a way out of the present darkness. For me, kind of to kind of address this question about what is the charge in the current moment, I believe that it's about right now returning to kind of a larger tradition of organizing and finding and building these coalitions with different groups. I really think that the future is organizing. I think there's a lot of power in organizing. But one of the things I've tried to think through, and I don't have good answers to this at all, but is about one of the benefits in focusing on current contemporary Black Lives Matter organizers and previous organizers for the protection of Black lives is a question about how should we reimagine a new just future, right? I think that part of the charge is also in terms of to rethink and reimagine the present and the future in a way that perhaps isn't bound by the institutions that we currently have. Andrea spoke in something that just is just echoing in my mind about there needs to be kind of alternative ways of policing that focuses on safety, right? And so in part, I think one of the reasons why I love that you said that is that I think a lot of the energy sometimes is on policing reform, right? And I don't think that's actually the way that we should proceed. I think that I think we need to kind of rethink what our targets, what our goals actually are. I am unconvinced, at least in terms of what history has taught me over the years, that the institutions that have done the harm against Black people and people of color can actually be repaired. I'm not at all convinced, and so I don't think that we should focus our energies on that. I think that we really should return to a tradition of radical organizing and have people who are more in touch with communities chart the way forward, whether that be around safety of people and or a host of different markers. But that's in terms of, I think, what our charge actually is, to, at some level, to divest so much of our trust and faith in institutions and really return that to people and to listen to others who have perspectives that are different from our own.